This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Care Notes with Doug Wilber from Cherished Companions. And Doug, I have to tell you something. I've noticed on my Facebook feed, I'm seeing a lot about Cherished Companions out there. So you are
Oh,
a lot of social media, and I've had people who have listened to the show have commented that, you know, oh, I didn't really know that they really existed. It's like, well, what do you think Doug's been doing all these years? But I think it's interesting because it is grabbing the attention of individuals who are out there, and especially those who are pondering, you know, is home care the right place for me?
hmm. Well, thank you for, that information. Um, Sometimes we know we're having an impact because we're the largest independent agency in the Cleveland area, uh, that doesn't mean people always know because we're not doing commercials. We're
Right,
not doing the things that some of the like franchise companies are doing. Our The way people hear about us literally is that usually they've heard that someone has told that they had a good
right.
experience, and I've always wanted to grow organically. I wanted to be, that company that the way people hear about us is people are talking about us because they had a great experience, and so that's satisfying. Thank you for that
You're welcome.
information.
And
So,
what are we going to talk about today?
well, what I really want to talk about is that journey from hospital to home, uh, that a patient will have or a family will have. Um, and I really am talking to those families that are sort of navigating that process. One of the things that um, is important for people to understand is that transition from hospital home is one of the most critical moments in a patient's recovery. And oftentimes it's not done right. It's rushed, it's unorganized, it leaves families scrambling. So often people, are kind of in the dark when they're in the hospital, and then they say, "Okay, it's time to go home," and it's like, "Oh my gosh, what do I do
Right,
right now?" And there's a lot of problems. The reason this matters is that 20% of Medicare patients who are really largely our target, group that we're dealing
right.
with, those that are, you know, um, that are aging, um, are readmitted within 30 days. That's a huge number. So getting this right is very, very important. Poor transitions lead to medication errors, it leads to falls, it leads to what is generally truly avoidable complications in many cases. What I hope that we'll learn today is some of the common pitfalls that put patients at risk. I want to give kind of some guidance to ensure a smooth transition home. And really, ultimately, I want to help us reduce the chances of readmission.
Sure.
So this is kind of a how-to guide, a little bit in going home. So I hope to walk through sort of a real life scenario of hospital home transition and, give people an actionable game plan to make the process as easy as possible for you and your loved ones that are making that transition home. Um, so let me just ask you a question. I think if my memory is right, you've had some recent experience with hospital issues. Can you kind of relate some of the issues that you've had?
Well, as you were talking, I'm remembering it's almost 2 years now, but I was out running errands. I fell and it was like, I can't move, which just didn't make sense to me that was hurting that much. And I was taken to the ER and for 4 days, they couldn't figure out what was wrong.
Yeah,
Um, and they wanted to release me. And I looked at my husband, who was working full time. My son had since moved out of the house. We don't have any family here. So it was like,
right.
so if I go home and I can't even get up the steps, what do I do? And I remember asking for a social worker. And I remember the nurse saying to me, "Oh, honey, you don't need a social worker. You've got your head on straight. You know what to do." And I said, "Okay, then I know what I'm going to do. Take me to a rehab facility." Not that I really wanted to do that, but I knew I had to figure out how to take care of myself, or my husband had to figure out through their help how to take care of me. And I would just remember the doctor coming in and telling me that I was like totally crazy. Go home, you'll be better at home. In
Hmm.
my experience, what I found was as soon as I got to rehab, and it was late on a Friday night, I had a nurse come in or aide, whoever she was. She got me up. And for 4 days, they had me lying in bed in the hospital. So
Yeah, right,
I now was being taught, yes, you're hurting, but if you don't move those legs, they're never going to move again. And so
right,
it was like within 5 days, I was out of there because I got the understanding of what was wrong, how to work on it, how to move forward. And they sat my husband down as well and explained to him. And so, number one, it got covered because I went directly from hospital to rehab. But I felt confident when I left rehab that I could go
mhm,
home.
right,
But I've seen others. Um, I had a friend who had a fall, well, probably about 6 months ago. She didn't want to go to rehab. She went home. She couldn't go up the steps. She laid on the couch, which made her worse.
right,
And nothing was getting done around the house because her husband was so used to her doing the things. He kept waiting for her to get up and doing it. So,
right.
you know, I can, I just can't imagine as we get older if we don't transition properly. Um, yeah, we are going
But
to end up back in the hospital.
yeah, I mean, the stories I could tell if I had 2 hours, it would kind of make people's hair curl because the fact is that this transition home is not done well. I mean, it isn't, and hospitals are trying; they're doing different things, but it requires someone taking the bull by the horn and saying, "Okay, we need this, and this." But unfortunately, the people that need to jump in and say we need this, and this are sometimes not present, or they don't have the knowledge of what those things are that need to be done.
Exactly.
Um, I'm a firm believer in rehab, like the facilities. I'm not a big fan of long-term,
Right.
care. Um, in facilities. I think where you can, it's better to be at home, which is, we've talked about that often, but I believe that short-term rehab stay can be transformative and give people the means not to get readmitted. So if someone can go into rehab, I think they really should, and take advantage of that Medicare benefit if someone's under Medicare.
Sure.
So let's kind of look at what typically happens before discharge. First thing is the patient who's perhaps a senior recovering from pneumonia, surgery, a fall, is deemed by the hospital stable for release. Now, what they deem stable for release is kind of more on the medical end
Right.
of things. In other words, they are not in dire need of, more surgery or other things like that. So, and then it kind of goes to a discharge planner, or a nurse who provides written instructions, a list of medications, and oftentimes a follow-up appointment. That's kind of what happens when they're saying, okay, it's time to go here.
Right.
And it's sort of at that point that a family member is oftentimes feel rushed or overwhelmed because they kind of dump it on you. It's like, what do I do now? And and here's where the problems and the gaps come in, because they're dumping all this information. They have some compromised patient, and many times that is going home. And about 40% of discharged patients misunderstand their care instructions. So that that happens right from the beginning, is that those care instructions are not fully understood. Um, it's for that reason that oftentimes you're getting written instructions, but even that is oftentimes not understood. And so they, more often than not, it gets ignored. One of the problems that I see is that patients may not fully grasp what their medication regimen is. I'll give you an example. You're on pills at home, you go into the hospital, they give you a prescription. Some people say, oh, I'll just go back to the pills I was taking before. Other people will say, I'll just add these new pills to the pills I was taking before. And they're not really clear. And it may be sometimes you're getting something that's substituting for something you're taking. Sometimes it's in addition to the pills that you're taking, and yet so often people go back to the other end. So those things can lead to medication errors. Families aren't properly trained on things like wound care or mobility assistance at times. Someone goes in the hospital, and before they were walking, they were doing things, and this can happen even coming out of long-term care. I'm not, excuse me, from rehab facilities. And it's like, okay, you're going home. Now what do I do? And so there are oftentimes maybe a wound that, as I mentioned before, that need to be cared for, or someone is now using a walker and they weren't using a walker before.
Right.
And how much assistance do I need? And sometimes it's really significant. Um, and then oftentimes there's a lack of clarity of sort of the when and how to schedule that follow-up care. And typically you need to follow up relatively soon with your own physician, in order to get um, things settled. Now, you'd be surprised the number of people who do not have a regular doctor.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and so that poses a whole nother set of issues. Um, so here's the first kind of big thing I would have to tell people. Take the time with the discharge planner, okay? If discharge instructions aren't crystal clear, ask for a discharge planning meeting before leaving the hospital. You need to absolutely know what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to do it. And I don't care if you have to ask 1,000 questions in order to get it straight. Neither you nor the hospital want you coming back. And I will tell you why the hospital doesn't want you coming back. Because reimbursement in part is made based on whether someone is coming back to the hospital. So they do have an interest in not seeing you come back from a financial standpoint,
Sure. Okay.
um, which is good. I mean, it means they have skin in the game. So, but for you, you have the real skin in the game. You know, your family member is the one who could end up back in the hospital, or a spouse, or yourself, depending
Sure.
on who's making the decision. So now, the second thing is that first 48 hours at home, it's critical. The risk of falls, confusion, medication mismanagement is the highest during that time. Okay. If you can get through those 48 hours, your likelihood of being rehospitalized goes down. So that's good. So, uh, so you have to make sure that's a critical period. Now, that might mean that family camps out there. Okay. It might mean that you have a home care agency such as ours that are coming in and camping out there.
Sure.
But getting through those 48 hours is going to be one of those key markers of whether you're likely to be successful in being home, or whether you're going to have a bigger problem. And, you don't want to go home and have a fall and then have a hip fracture,
Sure. Exactly.
because that will change your life potentially forever. So I don't know if people understand how important this is, but medication errors account for 125,000 deaths annually in
Oh,
the
wow.
US. So the, I remember one night being at someone's house. The person was discharged, and they were discharged in this case from a facility, if I remember right. And I was working with the wife, who was competent, and she was completely overwhelmed and confused with the medicines. And so I worked with her as she was putting the medicines in the pill case so that she got it right. And if I had not been there, I really, really doubt that she would have gotten it right. But because I, was there to kind of coach, to help, to work through it, it was successful. And this was a man who, her husband had Parkinson's,
Mm.
and it was very important that these medicines got right. And one of the issues was, she had all these pills. Like, I, I I remember it was a nightmare of pills, and they were different shapes because she was getting shapes of one sort from the discharge where they had given her these pills. She had different pills at home that were a different shape because they were in generic
Yes.
form,
Yep.
and and she just was, she was in her 80s, and she found it overwhelming and
Sure.
confusing. And because of that, that the fact that I was there to help her kind of walk through it, she ended up doing fine, or excuse me, he ended up doing fine because she ended up doing
Right.
fine
Exactly.
in so that ensuring that all prescriptions are filled, organized, and taken at correct times is up to someone. And, you have to kind of get through that. And usually it has to be a family member or a nurse or someone who's helping you walk through those steps.
You know, one of the things I've noticed recently is that when you're released, especially from a hospital, um, and they give you a new prescription, you can be released maybe in the evening, and your family member's taking you home, but the pharmacy's not open.
Oh, yeah.
You're supposed to take that medicine either tonight or tomorrow morning. And that happened when my husband was hospitalized a couple weeks ago. They went over everything with us and they said, now here's two new pills and he must take them tonight. And I looked at the clock and I said, the pharmacy closes in 10 minutes. I can't even drive there in 10 minutes. And they looked at me and they said, well, I guess you'll do the best you can.
Wow.
He had been on the medication in the hospital for 24, 36 hours. Okay. And as I read the thing on it, it says, do not miss a dose.
Right.
And so I said that to the nurse, and she goes, well, what do you want me to do? And I said, well, then can we get some from the hospital pharmacy? She says, well, you wouldn't want to pay the price. Didn't even
Mm.
offer it to us. And I I wrote about this, and I've had a lot of people who contacted me and said, yes, the same thing has happened to me.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that I've walked people through this sort of nightmare scenario. One of the things that happens is they say take it on these regular basis. And then what'll end up happening is you don't know when the last time they took it. And so there have been many times I've had to call a nurse and say, when did the patient take it last?
Right,
And a family member really needs to do it because if it's something that, like blood pressure medicine and it's new, did they take it in the morning? Did they take it in the afternoon? When was it that they last got it? Because the medicines, let's say it's every 24-hour medicine, it makes a difference whether you
right,
took it at night or in the morning. And um so there needs to be an advocate. There needs to be someone standing in the gap there. And typically that's a family member that should be doing it. But they don't have oftentimes the wherewithal or the
yeah, right,
understanding of what they need to really know in this situation. But you do need to know what times, you do need to
yeah,
know those other things. So the the big thing is, again, sure, all prescriptions are filled, organized, taken at correct times. Those things have to be taken into account. The next thing is someone needs to go into the home and and ideally, especially if mobility or safety is a factor, because you can go into the hospital walking and you can come out of the hospital and not be walking,
right,
okay, or not be doing well as far as strength. And it doesn't take long in the hospital to lose your strength, to lose your ability to ambulate or to lose your ability to ambulate effectively. So you need to ensure that rugs are removed. Um, those throw rugs all
right.
over the house. Those things are like, that's like screaming, trip over me,
Yeah,
fall on the ground, break your hip. You might as well. I'm maybe I should start selling little rugs that say break your hip.
yeah,
You know, so grab bars, they need to be installed or some sort of mechanism to hold on to. Making sure pathways are clear. Someone's home and they have a walker now. Those things, and so often I go into homes, and it is really is um, full of clutter. Now, it wouldn't necessarily be seen as clutter, but the way that things are positioned now, it's become a safety
right,
hazard in going home. And someone has to take the time to be able to say, okay, let's clear this out. Let's make sure that this pathway is wide enough and open enough that if someone's using a walker, let's say, that they can walk through and get to where they need to go without the chances of getting caught on something and tripping on something. So and then I think you have to consider the emotional or psychological impact of being in the hospital, because you come out of the hospital and and I think you were hinting at this before, but the patients feel anxious. They feel vulnerable,
Right.
depressed after hospitalization. And I can tell you, if someone's going to a home alone, times 10. Now, if a spouse is going home, um, I mean, going to home where there's a spouse, in all likelihood, the person that is going to be anxious, depressed, and feeling vulnerable is going to be that spouse.
Right.
Because, like, what do I do? I'm old myself, and so one of the key actions that people have to take is, in going home, they have to get the daily routine, the meals, medication, rest period, all set out. They need to monitor the patient for signs of things like discomfort, confusion, worsening symptoms, so as to have early intervention if something is going awry. And again, you think about someone going home alone, who's going to be doing that? It
Exactly.
has to be done. And yet, so often it's like, okay, you're home, you know, and and then I think even things like thinking about emergency numbers, making those easily accessible, for whether it be that for that individual or for, others. Who do we call?
Right.
What do I do in these circumstances? So then, let's kind of we looked at the first 48 hours. Now let's look at what 2 weeks look like, that time period. So often people are still healing. So you fell and you broke your ribs. Did you feel good immediately?
No, no.
Not at all. So the body is still healing. The risk of complications remain high. They probably told you, but when you fall and break your ribs, what is the biggest complication that people
Oh,
have?
pneumonia.
Yeah, exactly. And it's because they're not moving. It
Right.
hurts too bad to move. And so you get a complication that most people wouldn't even think about. All they're thinking is, I'm going to stay really, really still,
That doesn't
because if
hurt.
I move, yeah,
Yeah.
it's going to hurt like heck. So, and then make sure you follow up with the doctors, physical therapists, make sure the home health nurses are in and it's scheduled and it's going. And that should happen really quickly. You shouldn't be waiting 2 weeks
Sure.
in most cases before PT, OT, or others, if you're having that benefit come in. And again, take advantage of that benefit. Get them out if it's something, typically they'll come out when there's been a change. Get that follow up, have a medical professional be able to see it. Now, for caregivers, this is sort of that period of reality check. Um, there is Most times, I think that family members will take on the caregiving role, and they'll do it without realizing the demands. And some people say, oh, I'll just stop in once a day to see mom. Well, that's not going to work in
Yeah.
many cases. You're probably going to have to camp out there. The needs are going to be high. Uh, uh, Currently in the United States, about 53 million Americans provide unpaid caregiving, often leading to severe burnout in many cases. Um, the signs of caregiver burnout is going to be exhaustion, stress, resentment. If you're feeling that, you're really in need of secondary help, from
Absolutely.
companies like ours, or other family members, whatever, because more often than not, one person is going to take on the burden of things, and they're going to have to learn to delegate. They should not be taking that on. And if they're feeling stressful, if they're feeling exhaustion, if they're feeling that resentment, it's time to get extra help, period. No questions asked,
And a lot of family members, they think they're doing you a favor by taking care of you, um, but it's not in their nature. Okay.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Uh, my husband is absolutely wonderful, but when it comes to taking care of me, he doesn't know what I like to drink. He doesn't know what I like to eat. He'll say he's hungry. If I say I'm not hungry right now, then he forgets about it. My
Yeah.
problem is I don't speak up. Okay. And so caregiving can be not great for the patient, but also the patient may not be appreciating the caregiver. And so I think we have to be open minded and say, am I really the right person to be doing this? What
All
is
right.
my best role? And we finally have agreed that if I ever needed anything more than I did when I broke my shoulder, he would have somebody here because
Yeah.
he was almost afraid to touch me. And truthfully, I was afraid for him to touch me as well because
Right.
my whole right side was hurting. So I think we have to look at both ends. The poor caregiver is going through so much, but the patient, you know, does can't always say what they want.
Well, and in your case, he's at an age where he's still is physically
Yeah,
relatively competent, as far as, I mean, other than just age-related things,
right,
he has strength or other things that, but I will tell you, um, that what so much of caregiving is technique. So, part of it is hard. You just want to do things. But I so often will see someone who's 85 years old and trying to take care of their husband that's 89 years old. And that 85-year-old is barely functioning on their own, trying to take care of an 89-year-old
yeah,
who is a huge fall risk. And my fear is, okay, we're going to have two people falling,
right, exactly.
and potentially, the person that may end up with a broken hip may not be
The
that 89
caregiver.
year old, it may be the
Yeah,
85-year-old. And but I also think in that 2 week period, kind of getting back to what we were saying before, you have to look for the warning signs of trouble, things like sudden confusion, delirium. That means maybe that person has grown septic or having other complication. If their pain or swelling is suddenly getting worse, or even not suddenly, if it's progressively getting worse, um, it that means trouble is likely brewing. And things like changes in appetite, energy level, person comes home and they're sleeping all the time, that's saying, okay, in many cases maybe something else is happening. So now, I do want to talk about the steps that can be taken for a smooth transition. um, you know uh, the big thing is planning ahead before discharge. And frankly, this is likely to go on deaf ears, but in general, you need to have a plan in place. Like you talked with your
right,
husband and said, okay, if something serious goes on, um, we've talked about it. Let's,
right.
get more help than what you can provide. And frankly, even, there are times where people will interview with me and they'll get paperwork set up so that if they ever need help, it's set. it's ready to go. And I remember one of our early cases, it was a family, they were out of town. They said, look, both my mom and dad are not doing well. We're home over Christmas. Um, we want to set something up else or something up because my dad's in a wheelchair and my mom, physically is not doing well. And sure enough, um, she ends up going to the hospital. The neighbor, fortunately stepped in for a bit. Family called and said, glad we had things arranged.
Yeah.
Can you now jump in and help, mom and dad with things? And so we did. We stepped in. We helped him, and then we helped her when she got home. And so, but that pre-planning is something that is very rarely done. But boy, talking things through beforehand is really important. You think about like as kids, we just had storms move in through the
Right.
day. Do you remember how we were taught as kids, go in the hall, cover your head if there's
Yes,
a tornado
exactly.
come
Yeah.
through? And why do they do that? Is there that type of planning that happens? Well, it's because when something does happen, you kind of kick in fire
Right.
drills. Same thing. You kick in, people do it, and they're far less likely to panic and far less likely to make bad decisions by having something set and in place. Um, so, so one of the things is making sure that you ask the hospital team certain things, what medications are being prescribed, how should they be taken. Make sure you're asking those questions. Now they'll quickly come in and tell you, but you need to ask if they don't tell you because things sometimes will get missed.
Right.
Things like are there movement restrictions? Are the things I shouldn't do? Have there been diet changes because of whatever has gone on? What warning signs should I look for? And making sure that, like, someone had a cut or, something happened and, what would be something that isn't going well
Sure.
after these stitches and um, or things like pneumonia when you broke your ribs,
Right.
and then and then the next thing is who do we contact if there's a problem? Like, do we come right back to the hospital? Should we call, family doctor? What happens if it, it happens at night, etc. Um, Preparing the home in advance is really important. Now, a lot of these things ideally should be done in general for folks, um, but but I think that and looking ahead at things is something that most people won't do. So at the very least, figuring out transportation, how is transportation home going to be arranged? Especially if things like sedation was used
Sure.
or something like that. Um, Making sure that there are nutritious, easy to eat meals at the home, something like soft foods if needed. Getting that arranged prior to someone actually going home. Adjusting the sleeping area. If you have to go up, a flight of steps to go to bed, and yet you're not able to do that and going home, bed has to be moved
Right.
downstairs or something has to be set up so that that person can function. Maybe they can function okay at home, but they're not going to be able to go up and down the stairs, or they shouldn't go up and down the stairs because they may fall down.
Right.
You know? So, um, in the first couple days after, the immediate post discharge care, again, just repeating that ensure all medications are taken correctly, set up a daily health log, things like blood pressure, temperature, um, monitoring symptoms, keep keep that written down and a log of what's going on. Rest is essential for healing, but it's also a balance. You're needing to rest, but you need to move so
Right.
that you don't get things like pneumonia. And so you have to strike that balance. And day to 3 to 5, it's all about routine and observation. So check for signs of complication, redness around the wound, unusual swelling, calling the doctor if there's any concerns whatsoever. Don't wait for the next appointment if there's a problem. So often people, say, I don't want to bother. I'm going to be there next week
Right.
anyway, and then they end up back in the hospital because a phone call may have saved a bigger issue if they had gotten some clarity from their doctor. Again, I'll go back to that mobility thing. Too much or too little are, as far as movement, are
Right.
both harmful. And you have to strike that balance based on the individual's need. That if you have 5 people going home, what is too much or too little is going to probably
Right.
be different for each of those different people. And then make sure that follow-up appointments happen. Do you know that 50% of discharged patients skip their follow-up care? And what is that going to lead to? I'm telling you, it will lead to increased risk, which is likely to lead to something like the rehospitalizations. And we already talked about how frequently that
Right. Right.
rehospitalization happens. So, when you go to the doctor, make sure that the doctor in that appointment evaluates like any medication side effects, making sure that things like the wound is healing well, or any other type of thing that's going on, that your progress is according to where it should be
Sure.
based on being released from the hospital, and that the milestones, both past and in the future, are being monitored. Have I hit the milestones I should be at when I go into my doctor, and what milestones should I look at in the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, etc. And in the end, it's really important to reduce the risk of readmission. That's going to cost you money. It's going to cost the system money. It's going to be horrible for the psyche. Um, so there are apps that can be used to monitor meds or to act as reminders. Use that if you need to. Remember that many people have telehealth for check-ins. Sometimes it's numbers that you can call that doesn't have your doctor, but many doctors can use telehealth
Right.
themselves now. And that's one of the great things that's happened, I believe, with COVID. There's a lot of bad that happened,
Yeah.
but that was one of the good things, is that you can get telehealth. As a matter of fact, our nurse recently had something, a respiratory infection, and she was able to get telehealth versus doing the like urgent
Sure.
care,
Yeah.
or one of the other options that might have been more possible for her. She got medicine the same day as that. It it cut short or what was likely going to happen with her, because they prescribed an antiviral, and her recovery was so quick, and it was because she ended up with a telehealth appointment. um, uh, Things like fall detection devices use tech to stay on track. Those things are very, very important. And then, I had said before that I am an advocate of um, rehab, and take advantage of that Medicare plan short-term benefit that happens after a hospital stay, where you can get nursing, PT, OT, and that's all a part of the
Absolutely.
plan,
Absolutely.
for it. And then, obviously, I would be remiss if not saying about hiring a professional caregiver. If, getting a home care agency that can handle this quickly, like ours, where there's training and other things that happen with folks. And that can relieve stress for the family. It can prevent problems with the caregiver. And, I have to say that this is one of the most critical steps that most people will um, take to actually prevent a bigger problem or a bigger issue, or for that particular person. So, if I were to recap things, the one thing I would say is remember that 48 hours is the most critical time in preventing complications. Um, those things that I mentioned are going to be really, really clear. Second thing is demand. If you have to, clear discharge plans, get clarity. This is something that the hospitals are responsible for. Make sure that you get all the clarity you need before someone goes home. And, most of us don't have the background that, say, I do,
Sure.
with healthcare, and you just have to get clarity. If you don't understand things, don't think you're bothering someone. Just ask, and until you are, I used this term before, until you're crystal clear. And then make sure that you get regular monitoring, follow up, professional support, all to reduce the risk. These things that I mentioned today are the critical things that will make all the difference on whether someone's going to end up back in the hospital, or even worse, having, huge complications that could complicate the rest of their life. And if you do these things, you're far less likely to have that be the end that someone has, that is not good, versus the end that is good, which is a nice healthy recovery and
Right.
doing well and being back to normal, or to a new normal. And the big thing that I have to say is, so often it's not the person themselves that is going to be the advocate. They need an advocate.
Absolutely.
I've oftentimes told my caregivers, there's nothing more terrifying than a person alone in an emergency room that is older without an advocate. And I believe the same thing in the hospital. There's nothing more terrifying than a person in the hospital without an advocate. If you're in the hospital, more often than not, you need someone there who's going to stand in the gap and be your advocate, be the one that fights for you, sort of be your hero, working on your behalf, because you are more likely not confused, um, uh, uh, in pain, whatever, you fill in the gap. And so, and again, remember home care. That is one of the critical things that can make a huge difference in someone to be able to be successful in a home setting. So, just some thoughts.
Very good information. And just so our listeners understand, for the most part, we're talking about seniors. But I will tell
Yeah.
you, when my son 2 years ago had his gallbladder attack and had no idea what it was, he was living 1,000 miles away. He went to the hospital, EMT took him, and he's being told, we don't know what's going on, but it doesn't look good for you. Now,
Mm,
that had been the most terrifying thing that a young man could hear that far away from home. So
yeah.
when I got the phone call, of course, I got it on an airplane as soon as I could. And he had never really been alone and sick. And so he needed an advocate. And I
Right.
came in and did exactly that. And luckily, I knew that when we brought him home from the hospital, the first 48 hours were going to be the most, as they said, dangerous because he had surgery on a Friday night and Saturday afternoon they were sending him home.
Mm.
And I had to check his wounds, and I'm not a good nurse. I am definitely not. But I did what I had to do. And his house was not set up with food the right way. So luckily, my husband was there. And so I made a list, and he went and got those things. But everyone needs an advocate.
Oh, yeah.
We can assume that somebody knows exactly what they're talking about. But sometimes, if we just jump in a little bit, we can make things even better. And it makes the other person feel special. And that's important.
And to your point, you know, oftentimes they'll come in and they'll say, "Well, you need to do this, 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 and this, and this, and this," and and they rattle off 15 things. Well, most people can remember about 7 things in short-term memory. You don't necessarily have a piece of paper where you're writing things
Right.
down, you know, and you probably should. When you're in the hospital, you probably should have a piece of paper and a pen and to be able to do it. But, that's, best case
Right.
scenario where you're actually writing things down and clarifying and asking, questions. But they're rushing in, they're telling you you're not doing that. They leave the room and you say, what in
Yeah.
the world? I remember this. It just my daughter was diagnosed with something a number of years ago that was significant and serious, and I remember when they came in, they said it is like I walked out and I was in such shock. I didn't even know what they
It's
had
a, yeah.
had said as far
Yeah.
as now I am someone who is absolutely adept at medical things. I mean, I am, I grew up around it. I understand it. I have a really solid medical knowledge. And I was like, what did they say? And if they had not given me papers, when we were going home, I would have had absolutely no idea what they had just said to me,
Sure.
as far as because the first thing I heard was basically this is serious,
Yeah.
kind of a thing. And then my mind just kind of went blank because I love my daughter,
Yeah.
and so all the fears and all the other things that happen, and I wasn't able to click into clinical and usually I can click very quickly into
Yeah.
clinical, and especially if it's about me, I can really click into clinical and say, okay, I get it, and think about it, ponder or whatever, dissociate a little bit in order to be able to be sort of that third party
Right.
observer and get something, and all that was out the window, and that's someone who's trained and skilled and has this as a backbone, and I can't imagine what most people go through in these circumstances in order to remember it. So and I that actually probably is one last thing is ask for materials. and read those materials. Read to get an understanding, whether it be a diagnosis or what you're supposed to be doing or whatever. Um, Make sure you get stuff in writing, because again, remember that seven, which in
Right.
kind of in a stress situation probably goes down to about two, things that you remember, and say, okay, yeah, I need to get something that is tangible so I can look at this afterwards, think through it, and have a clear understanding. So anyway,
Well,
um,
thank
I, I
you.
I enjoyed the discussion.
Yes,
Please, I mentioned this before, and you had mentioned about social media. If this is helpful, if you're getting good stuff out of this, please, drop us a note if there's things that you want, differently as an audience. Let us know, and um, I really would like to hear back from people. So,
sounds wonderful. Well,
all right.
thank you again. Enjoy the day, and we'll see you at the end of the month.
All
Bye-bye.
right. Sounds good. Thanks. Bye bye.